Thank you everyone for coming and welcome to the Donia Center for Human Rights panel on reproductive rights as human rights, international perspectives. I'm Sue Ann Caulfield. I'm the Associate Director of the Donia Center. Steve Retner right here is the Director of the Donia Center, for those who don't know him already. And we're especially pleased to be partnering on this event with the Women and Gender Studies Department, the Global Feminisms Project, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and the Center for Middle East and North African Studies. And before we get started, I want to thank Wes Wright, who is our completely indispensable program associate who does all of the behind the scenes work to make all these events happening. So thank you. And I want to let you know just about a couple of our upcoming events. The last event for the fall semester for the Donia Center will happen on December 4th. We're hosting a panel called The Hazards of Reporting on Human Rights Abuses, which is a roundtable featuring 3 Knight Wallace Journalism Fellows, one of whom is from Kyrgyzstan, another from India, another from Afghanistan. Should be a really interesting event. And then we'll launch our winter semester with a lecture. It's our annual Martin Luther King Day lecture. And this year it will feature Commissioner Gloria Demis of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And her lecture is titled The Racial Justice Approach in the Inter-American System of Human Rights. So look out for that. All this information is on our website, and you can also sign up for our mailing list. Please do. And you'll get all this information, and not too much, not overwhelming us. Okay, so today's event will be chaired by Dr. Michele Heisler, who is a professor of internal medicine, health behavior, and health equity here at Michigan Medicine. She also serves as medical director at the New York-based organization Physicians for Human Rights. And she's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. She's recognized for her pioneering research on the intersections of health, human rights, and health equity, both domestically and internationally. So please join me in thanking Dr. Heisler and welcoming our distinguished panelists.
I'll use this. It's a small room. I almost don't need it, but I'll put it on. So yes, good afternoon, and really pleased to see all of you here. I feel very privileged to have a chance to quickly introduce our panelists who will be talking about a range of challenges now to reproductive justice, reproductive rights, women's health. So I think I'll start first. I'll introduce the person on Zoom. You can't see it, Payal Shah. And Payal and I just are coming from a strategic huddle that we had at Physicians for Human Rights among a range of communications, advocacy, research, legal, about what do we do now around the field of reproductive justice in the US. So we're fresh from that discussion, and Payal may share some of our thoughts about what our strategic priorities need to be in this next year or so. Payal is Director of Research, Legal and Advocacy at Physicians for Human Rights, and she oversees all of PHR's efforts to document human rights violations, support accountability, and advocate for justice for survivors. And she also leads all of our research, litigation, and advocacy on reproductive justice in the US. Prior to this position, she also had served as PHR's director of our program on sexual and gender-based violence in conflict zones. She's an international lawyer with expertise. I know one lawyer here, so I'm pointing to her. Sure, there are other lawyers, but she is an international lawyer with expertise in gender health and human rights. And now our organization, PHR, is not focusing on reproductive justice issues except in the US. But Payal herself has a long history of work, advocacy around the world. She directed the Center for Reproductive Rights, an organization, if you don't know, you should look it up. It's doing really leading litigation in this country and elsewhere to defend pregnant patients' rights to have bodily autonomy. She's a fellow with the University of Toronto's International Sexual and Reproductive Health Law Program. She was head of CRR's Asia program, working on legal strategies. She established the right to survive. She worked on legal strategies to establish the right to survive pregnancy and childbirth in India, accountability for denial of contraceptive care, which in Manila, in the Philippines, and the adoption of a regional action plan in Asia to address child, early, and forced marriage in South Asia. To my left, I'm thrilled to have Tamara Davila. Tamara is here, and I'm going to use first names. I know different people use different things. Please call me Michelle, and I just like to refer people that are my colleagues on panels by their first name. And they're all doctors and have lots of important titles. But Tamara is a Nicaraguan psychologist, feminist activist, human rights defender. Since 2004, she has worked extensively with women's organizations and other civil society groups that promote sexual and reproductive rights. She's advocated on behalf of survivors of violence against women and girls, and has been an active participant in demonstrations and initiatives regarding gender-based violence in Nicaragua. And she helped stage the performance of Violador en tu Camino, a rapist in your path in downtown Managua. Since 2014, Tamara has been a member of the political party UNAMOS, which was before known as MRS. And due to her advocacy in defense of human rights, the rule of law, her leadership in the widespread opposition movement, she was imprisoned and placed in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years. And on February 9th, 2023, Nicaragua sent her into exile along with 221 other Nicaraguan political prisoners and was granted humanitarian parole status here in the US. So I'm really, really eager to hear what she has to say. Our final panelist is Seda Saluk, who is an assistant professor in the Women's and Gender Studies program here at the University of Michigan. She's a feminist anthropologist. She works at the intersection of medical anthropology, science and technology studies, and Middle East studies. Her research broadly focuses on the politics and ethics of medical technologies through the lenses of gender, race, and ethnicity. She's currently working on her new book project, which is called Monitoring Reproduction, Surveillance and Care in Turkey. And this book examines the rise of reproductive surveillance within the context of demographic anxieties over changing fertility patterns among Turkish and non-Turkish communities. She has received multiple grants from a wide range of donors, a wide range of fellowship programs. Her work has appeared in high-impact journals in the fields in which she works, and just really eager to hear what she has to say. And I'll stop there. And I think, at least according to the agenda, well, I don't know if it's in the order of what we were sent.
I think we want Seda to go first.
Okay.
She turns the PowerPoint off, then we'll.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll start with Seda. Thank you.
Michelle, for the introduction. And I also want to thank to the Doña Human Rights Center for the invitation and also for making this event happen. Today, I will talk about the current attacks on reproductive rights and freedoms in Turkey under the President Recep Tayyip Erdogan regime, which has been in power since 2003. I will also discuss some of the grassroots and feminist responses to these attacks. And I will organize my talk in two interventions. First, using the case of Turkey, I will argue that the current attacks on reproductive autonomy are not new, but must be understood within a longer history of empire, state, and nation-making. Second, these attacks, both today and in the past, are always selective and stratified. While some individuals and communities are empowered to reproduce, others are disempowered. Therefore, responses to the attacks on reproductive rights and freedoms should take into consideration how they are part and parcel of a long history, and they are also highly stratified. And I will also show some examples how feminists in Turkey use different strategies to do that. So, like many other contexts around the world, reproduction has become a highly politicized topic in Turkey since the early 2000s. Pronatalist discourses and policies have been increasingly mobilized. Politicians have been encouraging marriage and childbirth, trying to limit abortion, and most famously inviting women to give birth to at least 3 children for the sake of the Turkish nation. As a father of 4, Erdogan, who is in this image, is one of the most vocal and high-profile speakers on this issue. He argues that C-section, contraception, and abortion are all antinatalist procedures imposed by Western powers or outside enemies on the Turkish nation to limit the growth of the population. But there's also usually a tendency to exceptionalize these authoritarian right-wing populist politicians and their regimes in public discussions. And these discussions often frame them as kind of an anomaly or a direct break from the earlier political or historical context. But these discussions I think limiting because regulating reproduction has always been a central strategy of empires and nation states, whether by encouraging people to have more children or limiting their reproduction in different ways. Pronatalism, or policies and propositions that aim to increase population, has been especially popular in contexts where fertility rates are seen as kind of in dangerous decline. And also ethno-nationalism and eugenics have been intertwined projects in these contexts from the beginning. Concern has never been just about quantity, but also about quality. There is always the question of who should reproduce, how, and where. And in many pronatalist contexts like Turkey, the declining whiteness, however that whiteness is defined in that context, the declining whiteness of the population and a takeover by the poor, by immigrants, and by ethno-racially minoritized groups always also come into picture. So there are these broader demographic anxieties about the so-called others. Turkey has gone through several pronatalist and antinatalist periods. The late Ottoman period and later the early Turkish Republic adopted a clearly pronatalist approach promoting population growth. So today's pronatalist policies very much also draw on these earlier pronatalist years. The Republican elites at the time saw population increase as a necessary tool for political, military, and economic well-being of the newly established nation state. And this meant banning abortion, criminalizing contraception, and rewarding childbearing with monetary incentives and state medals. The first pronatalist period also coincided with other human rights violations, such as the Armenian genocide in 1915, the Dersim massacre in Turkey's Kurdistan in 1937, and the Istanbul pogrom in 1955. The nation-making was not just a biopolitical project, but it was also a necropolitical project, which means not only who should live and how, but also who should die and how was part of the nation-state's project of making its own history and identity and emergence. And fast forward to the 60s and 80s, politicians saw the increase in population rates as a threat to the economic growth. This was also in line with the global rhetoric at the time that there needs to be a population control mechanism to limit the population of the entire world, but especially either the global populations from the global south or minoritized populations within countries in global south. So during these years, politicians adopted an antinatalist approach. In 1983, abortion was legalized in Turkey with a 10-week limit after conception and also with a spousal or parental consent. In 1985, population planning policy passed and the state started providing free contraceptives. This is kind of a country with a national healthcare system. When Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, took power for the first time in 2003, and they are still in power for more than 2 decades, the country's population was still above the replacement levels, but steadily declining. And this is kind of a global trend, right? The decline in fertility rates. In a country with state-funded legal abortions up to 10 weeks since the 80s and a national healthcare system that provides free or low-cost contraception, Erdogan's pronatalist statements like at least 3 children often spark outrage in public, both among his supporters and among his opponents. While the legislation is still in favor of providing abortion and contraception, there are, of course, limitations for people's access to sexual and reproductive health services. The country does not recognize same-sex marriages. The use of assisted reproductive technologies is restricted to only married heterosexual couples. Third-party reproduction, such as egg, sperm, or embryo donation and surrogacy, are strictly prohibited. And compulsory sterilization was a prerequisite for receiving gender-affirming care and legal gender change until 2017. Erdogan had initially avoided making overtly religious or ethno-nationalist references in his call to at least 3 children in the early years of his power. But as his government gained more power and eliminated its rivals from state institutions over the years, he became more vocal about whose reproduction he values and encourages. After the AKP government established a new presidential system with a referendum and consolidated power in 2017, it became clearer that the intended audience of his party's call for at least 3 children was pious Sunni Muslim Turkish women. In November 2017, he advised his quote-unquote Muslim Turkish sisters to reproduce and not to be overpowered by members of what he called the terrorist organization, a rhetorical proxy for dissident Kurds in Turkey, the country's largest ethnic minority. In his speech, he equated Kurds with terrorism and repeated a common and highly racialized and unsubsidized belief that Kurdish women have much higher fertility rates than Turkish women. Again, the discourses around hyperfertility or hyperreproduction was very prevalent. Erdogan and his party members' selectively pronatalist statements have been met with sporadic and everyday protest, but also with more organized forms of resistance. So here, there are a couple of street writings from Istanbul. The first graffiti says at least 3 cats. The second stencil is at least 3 beers. And the alcohol tax is skyrocketing in Turkey right now, so that's another thing that his regime is doing. The second stencil is, in some protests, people chanted at least 3 gays. And on the right sticker, we see 3 police figures. And I think this is a particularly brilliant critique of the intense and increasing militarization and policing in Turkey. Fertility rates are still steadily declining. By 2023, the rate had decreased to 1.51 children per woman, below the population's replacement level of 2.1 children. So overall, it's safe to say that many people do not follow the government's advice to give birth to at least 3 children. And of course, there are various reasons for that. Fertility. So Erdogan's first anti-abortion remarks in 2012 took place against the backdrop of a then recent airstrike on the Kurdish border village Roboski by the Turkish military. During this attack, also known as the Roboski massacre, the Turkish military killed 34 Kurdish civilians, most of whom were children. In his statement, Erdogan equated abortion with this airstrike and argued that abortion is also a massacre. In the days after this statement, hundreds of women's and feminist groups mobilized and organized countrywide demonstrations. Activists later established an initiative called Abortion is a Right, Decision Belongs to Women platform to initiate a large-scale abortion rights campaign. In their protest, activists condemned both the government's attack on abortion rights and the state violence toward Kurdish lives in Roboski. These mass protests and the subsequent campaign received much attention from the media and mobilized intense pressure on the government. The government later had to withdraw its proposal to limit abortion. So abortion is still legal up to 10 weeks. And it's funded by the state. So it's also important to note here that policies and legislation are crucial for access, but even in the case of progressive or relatively progressive legislation, public discourse or politicians' statements can have far-reaching consequences and can limit safe and affordable reproductive health services. Although abortion is still legal in Turkey, it is getting more and more difficult to access, especially for poor women or for people in more rural communities. Public hospitals, state-funded public hospitals are afraid of providing abortion services due to the fear of retaliation and losing their resources. So the Turkish government is still quite vocal and active in its pronatalist agenda, but feminist groups and social movements are also actively fighting back against the increasing reproductive control in different ways. So it's an ongoing struggle. Thank you very much.
Again, we'll have a chance to have questions and discussion. I do think it's interesting that we'll also see in this country that we're coming into a very pro-natalist period. And I think it's interesting for those of us now thinking about the US, how somehow Turkish civil society has prevented Erdogan from criminalizing abortion. So I think that's interesting how that has been successful, because I'm sure Erdogan has wanted for a long time to criminalize abortion. So we'll now turn to Payal in the sky, who will, I think, focus her remarks on what's happening in the US.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and thank you so much to the Denia Center for having me here. I'm really sorry I can't be with all of you in person. So I was asked to speak specifically about the role of international human rights in advocating against abortion bans and in promoting reproductive rights and justice. And I have to say it's a difficult topic in many ways, especially after the election, really thinking about how little I think this next administration will care about human rights. And it really prompted me to think quite a lot about exactly, I think, where the last presentation ended, which is around organizing and around how movements sort of form and combat the attempts to control populations through control on reproduction, and the ways in which human rights discourse can actually be really important in mobilizing. It can be a rallying cry, as we heard, right, in Turkey, abortion is a right. And so thinking about both the formal power of abortion rights in challenging bans and laws, but also the informal power, the power that comes from, I think, the way in which it can move populations and really help individuals really think about their reproduction in a different way and combat this population control lens or this lens around reproductive controls on reproductive autonomy as part of kind of entrenching systems of power. So I think I'll start just maybe by introducing myself. As Michelle gave a great introduction, I will say I did not direct the Center for Reproductive Rights. I directed the Asia program at the Center for Reproductive Rights. And there, actually, I had the opportunity to work in several contexts that had abortion bans, including Nepal, which in 2002 had one of the most restrictive abortion laws in all of Asia. And then actually now by 2024, but actually even by 2009, had moved towards recognizing constitutionally the right to reproductive health in its new interim constitution, and then interpreting that right to include a right to abortion being free and accessible in public healthcare centers, pushing back at attempts to regulate and bring into being spousal consent laws and things like that. So it is possible, change is possible. There is hope, and I sit with that quite a lot as we are now here in the U.S. and really processing the impact of the elections, the battle we've been fighting in the 2.5 years now since Dobbs overruled Roe, and then also what we think and are preparing for ahead. So first, I wanted to start, and because I'm not sure if everyone in the room is aware, I'm a lawyer, and so we'll get into the law a little, to explain a little bit how international human rights protects abortion. And I think that it's actually really important because there's been so much progressive development in international human rights law around abortion, and it was not it's been hard fought, hard won. And we are actually coming up this year on a major anniversary, right? The 30+ year anniversary now around Beijing, where we're now at the rallying cry of reproductive rights are human rights, right? And so it's both old and new in many ways, that we recognize reproductive rights as human rights. And so the way the international human rights framework has evolved is that reproductive rights are protected through a constellation of different rights. There isn't an explicit recognition in international human rights treaties, but there is a recognition, for example, that the right to life is violated where criminal abortion laws lead to maternal mortality and morbidity, where abortion bans, where abortion is criminalized. And I think that is something actually quite sweeping. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights recognizes this right to life, and then it's been interpreted by the UN body that is responsible for explaining, monitoring compliance with this treaty to actually include prevention of maternal mortality and morbidity and other harm and suffering arising from criminalization. And the Human Rights Committee has actually called on countries to decriminalize abortion holistically, and also at a minimum to legally guarantee a right to abortion in certain contexts, including life, health, in exceptions, right, where there's a threat to the life, threat to the health of the pregnant person, and then also in cases of rape and incest and severe fetal impairment. And so there's really significant recognition there, and it's an important recognition because there's often an attempt to push back and say, but isn't there a right to life of a fetus, or isn't there a right to life of the unborn? And actually what human rights law clarifies is no, there is, the state has an interest and can have an interest in protecting prenatal life, but rights accrue upon birth. And so really it's important to recognize when you have a pregnant person in front of you, they are a full person, and that it is their rights that really need to be prioritized. There's also recognition of abortion rights and the right to health, and there's guarantees around what that means, including that abortion needs to be accessible, it needs to be available, it needs to be affordable, it needs to be of good quality, and it needs to be provided in a way that is acceptable, that is without discrimination, and in a way that really meets the needs of the population. There's recognition of denial of abortion care as violating the right to non-discrimination, and the right to equality. And so recognizing that where health systems fail to provide for the abortion care that certain populations need, or one sex or the other may need, that is actually discriminatory. And it actually reflects gender-based stereotypes around women as mothers, women's role as child rearers and child bearers, and so then reflects these discriminatory gender norms that are also violations of human rights. And interestingly, and I think something Michele and I have spent a lot of time talking about, is the ways in which abortion bans are also recognized as being linked to torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And so that's something where in several countries now around the world, there's been recognition by the Human Rights Committee, the UN Human Rights Committee, on abortion bans as leading to preventable physical and mental trauma that rises to the level of torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And that's something that's important to recognize. I think folks often don't realize the way in which human rights law has evolved to understand the severity of harm that is caused by abortion bans. And I think it's a really important normative framing. And then finally, there's also protection in human rights law around the right to privacy, and also the right to determine the number and spacing of one's children. And so these two rights also come together to essentially protect reproductive autonomy. So we talk a lot about human rights law protecting reproductive health, and then also protecting reproductive decision-making, reproductive autonomy. And so those are the grounds, right? Those are the ways in which abortion is protected as a human right. But what the role of enforcement of these rights is really depends on the country where you are. There's some places, for example, where treaties, international human rights treaties, are legally binding. There are places where governments are responsible constitutionally to be interpreting their laws consistent with their international human rights obligations. And so the domestic legal framework will view abortion, the right to abortion, for example, as something that needs to be reconciled with their own national constitutional protections. The US, unfortunately, is not one such country. And the US is a country that really does not look at treaties as self-executing. We don't sign and ratify many treaties, for example. And even the ones that we do sign and ratify, we don't often view as binding on our own courts and our own interpretation. I was at an event yesterday on the rights of children and was speaking at that event and was reminded as I was preparing for that the US is the only country, for example, that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We are really quite exceptional in many ways around human rights. But in countries that do view it as legally binding, there's actually quite a lot that can be done. And so Michele referenced work that I had done with partners, including Human Rights Law Network in India, around building a state court litigation strategy to have the right to life in the Constitution of India interpreted to include reproductive rights. And the way that we did that was a combination of mobilizing evidence, but then also really working to bring in normative developments from international human rights law to help the court understand that they needed to interpret the right to life more broadly and to be consistent with the recognition in international human rights law around preventable maternal mortality as being a right to life issue. And so we worked court by court to build this recognition and really got to the courts pronouncing the right to survive pregnancy and childbirth as a fundamental right protected under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which protects the right to life. And so it was, there's obviously a lot of mobilizing and activism and other pieces that have to go into it, but on the litigation and the court level, this was a direct way that we were able to take what was happening in international law and make it more tangible. And there, it's actually one of the more rewarding, I think, litigation experiences of my life because it was not focused on punishment. It was actually focused on positive guarantees. And we were then able to use that case to do things like unstick the holdups that were happening at the local level around lack of access to blood because there wasn't a license being issued for the facility to be able to have access to the blood bank. There was another hospital or another healthcare center, not even a hospital, like a rural healthcare center that didn't have access to water, and we were able to then use this ruling to be able to say to the local authorities, you need to actually give water access to this facility. And within weeks, we were able to actually see the water, being connected and the pipes being put in. And so that was really a very powerful experience for me of seeing human rights in action. There are other places where international accountability can also be utilized to shine a light or to galvanize other reform or feed into reform. And I think of Ireland when I think of that. So, as many of you know, Ireland had an incredibly restrictive abortion law. And then very recently, just in the last less than 10 years, actually reformed their abortion law to be much more progressive. And it happened through a constitutional referendum that involved citizens actually being pulled together and mobilizing to actually make a decision on whether they viewed constitutional reform as something that needed to happen and then needed to be put on the ballot. And so that process, though, was really influenced and galvanized by two cases that were filed to the Human Rights Committee at the international level on two different women who had been denied abortion care, both of whom had fatal fetal impairments and needed to access an abortion and were forced to travel to the UK to access that abortion. And so it was in this case, the Human Rights Committee finding in both cases that this constituted torture and cruel and human degrading treatment. It constituted a violation of the right to equality and non-discrimination and the right to privacy, and essentially ordering the Irish government to respond and reform its constitution. And when the Irish Parliament essentially did an evaluation of what led to the abortion law reform in Ireland, one of the main factors they pointed to was this international accountability, which really clearly gave this normative recognition of abortion bans as leading to torture and cruel and human degrading treatment. And I think it mobilized and galvanized citizens in really understanding this story and the harm that was suffered. So I know I'm almost at time, but just to say, in the U.S., I think it's not because we don't have a legal system that reflects human rights treaties in the way that India does, for example, what we are left with is what I think more in line with the Irish example, where we're really thinking about normative framing. And I think many of you may be familiar, for example, here in the US, the reproductive justice movement, which is such a powerful movement that was founded by Black feminists in the 1990s, following Beijing, actually following the Beijing Platform for Action, the Beijing Conference and the Platform for Action, really recognizing that this framing of human rights was something different than what Roe v. Wade had. Roe v. Wade was really focused on privacy, and it was focused on the government not interfering with your abortion, your rights, your reproductive rights, or your bodily decisions. But human rights law talks not just about not interfering, right? It's not just about I don't engage, but it's actually that I have a proactive obligation to ensure your reproductive health and to ensure your autonomy. And that means I also need to ensure you have the funding, you have, the means to be able to make decisions, and not just that you have the right on paper. And so that framing has been incredibly powerful as an organizing tool in communities and community organizations around the country. It's something we've heard in our own work at PHR, where I work with Michele. And so I think that framing is something that is really powerful, and it's something that we continue to advocate for. At Physicians for Human Rights, where we work, we also talk quite a lot about clinicians as human rights defenders and understanding abortion care as and provision of abortion care is something providers do to uphold the rights of their patients and to be able to act in compliance with their patients' rights. And it's also a really important framing when we talk to clinicians about how abortion bans are making them complicit in violations of human rights, and that this is something that actually is unethical, right? It goes against a lot of the codes of ethics, for example, for a physician to be engaging in torture. So I think that's another piece that we're really working on, is how do we mobilize the human rights system to be able, and the human rights norms to be able to organize, to galvanize, to speak out against these rights. We also do quite a bit of work at the international level, trying to ensure that the U.S. Is held accountable at that level by the UN Human Rights Committee, for example, by the Human Rights Council for the violations that are occurring here. But similarly, also trying to ensure that the backsliding that's happening here in the US does not lead to backsliding globally, and that doesn't lead to these norms that I outlined at the beginning actually being eroded because the US is so influential internationally. And by flouting these international norms, we need to make sure that they are not undermining these norms for others. And so, for example, I'm going on Friday to speak at an Inter-American Commission event where it really is actually talking about what's happening here in the US and why it's so important for the Commission to speak out against it, even though the US is a major donor, right, to the Inter-American Commission, because it's so critical to prevent backsliding in the region, in globally, in the Americas regionally. So I'll stop there, but would be really interested to answer questions as they arise.
Thank you, Tanya. Now, Kamada, yeah.
Good afternoon to all. It's an honor for me to be here with Payal, Sira, Michele, and thank you, Suen, for this invitation and this panel. I will talk about the situation on Nicaragua, of Nicaraguan women, and the work that we do every day to sustain our bodies, our lives, and the lives of others to make a permanent change. In Nicaragua, we live under a dictatorial and familiar regime. And of course, since 2007, when Ortega and Murillo family came to the power, they start denying women's rights. That was the first step. And they start denying women's reproductive rights specifically. The rule of law has been dismantled. The Ortega regime is a dictatorship of the worst that we have in Latin America. Advances that women's gained before 2007 are lost. For instance, in Nicaragua, we used to have women's police stations which partner with women's civil organization and feminist women's organization to create safe spaces for women to report and address violence and to care for and protect female victims. The Ortega and Murillo family annulled the law and took down the entire system established to avoid violence against women and to care for and protect female victims. They criminalize any effort to rebuild that system in this moment. In 2006, 1 year before they arrived to the power, the Nicaraguan government prohibited the therapeutic abortion. One of the few countries in Latin America to do so, it's my country, Nicaragua, since that year. Before then, it was legal when justified for medical reasons. Now, women who have abortion and women who performs abortion can be jailed for 2 years, and medical personnel who perform abortion can be sentenced for between 1 or 10 years for any type of injury to the unborn child. This hurts girls' and women's life, and it increases maternal mortality, as Payal said, and the rates that we have related with maternal mortality are the highest that we had in our entire history as a country. In the last 6 years after the political crisis and the violence that started in 2018, the dictatorship confiscated an assets of more than 212 women's or feminist organizations and shoot down them and make illegal to reconstitute the work that they made to prevent violence against women. It is even illegal right now to raise money for their causes and their support. Hundreds of women involved with those organizations have been forced into exile. Violence against women in Nicaragua extends to the most terrible act of what Latin America feminists in the region we call feminicide. The murder of a woman and often their children by their partners or their husbands. Feminicide has increased annually since 2018 under a state apparatus entirely dedicated to control and repress the citizen. According to Catholics for the Right to Decide, that it's a grassroots organization who works in clandestinity right now to have these data and these numbers that I'm telling to you right now, they said that in 2023, more than 69 women were victims of feminicide. The majority of them were mothers. So far, this year, we have 18 feminicides in Nicaragua. At least 3 of these was committed by men with criminal records who were pardoned by the government. Worse, the Nicaraguan courts routinely pardon aggressors convicted of gender violence. These men received pardons for beating up women, and too many of those men went back home and killed their wife and their partners. The rate of another facts that it's affecting women in Nicaragua, it's the rate of adolescent pregnancy. The rates of adolescent pregnancies in Nicaragua are the highest in Central America. According to global research, the pregnancy rate among women aged 15 to 19 years in Nicaragua is the highest in the world, excluding the African continent, but it's higher than the rate for sub-Saharan Africa. as whole. Nearly a quarter of pregnancies in the country are to teenage mothers. In Nicaragua, between 2017 and 2021, there were over 1,000. I have problems with numbers.
1,600.
1,600.
1,600.
Thank you. 1,600 women's report rapes in a population of 6 million of people. At least 341 women and adolescents and girls became pregnant as a result of rapes. And according with data of the Legal Medicine Institute, that it's controlled by the regime, so we know that the numbers are higher, they said that the complication of pregnancy and childbirth are the leading cause of death in girls and adolescents in Nicaragua. Because of all of this, Nicaraguan feminists, and we said teenage pregnancy is not an isolated event, but rather a problem that it's part of the context of violence experienced by women in Nicaragua. Authoritarian regimes fear anyone who challenges their powers. This is a double true for women who, according to the current regime, shouldn't be out of the house anyway. Therefore, those who dare to question the controlling power must be double criminalized and punished for challenging and for participating politically. In other words, women must suffer for trying to break the patriarchal, thank you, political order. When I was in prison for those 607, no, 607 days, thank you. The few times that I had contact with others human was when the guards questioned me and demand me to know why I did not stay home with my child, feed her and console her. Why, they ask, did I cause her such suffering? Why was I so irresponsible? That was a constant question direct to the politically imprisoned mothers in El Chipote, the prison where I stay. The men in prison were not asked for those questions. To me, this kind of interrogation was a form of torture because it's related with what Payal said. Women exist only as mothers, not anymore in this context and in this reality in my country. And I should have, and I may, in that times, I made me keep questioning myself. Should I have stayed at home and not gotten involved in politics or not try to change things for women in my country? Today, Nicaraguan feminist women know our political participation is vital to the effort to stabilize our country and bring democracy back. We should continue to work for women and women's issues, and we must also join with organizations that are trying to bring democracy back to Nicaragua. These efforts support one another and must progress together. Unless everyone is free, no one will be free. Nicaraguan feminists are working to ensure that these efforts are directed towards the restoration of democracy institution. We will join the fight for democracy, understanding that democracy and human rights are inseparable and not for negotiation. We will continue to fight for women's issues too, because they must not be lost in a larger fight. Nicaraguan women have actively criticized the wrong perpetuated by the current regime. And because of that, no more public feminists public feminists are living in the country. All of us, we are in exile since that date. And that makes things for women who still are working there in the grounds, in clandestinity, a very, very dangerous situation for them. And it is terrible for women who need care, who need be attended, who need sexual and reproductive health, and who need services of abortions. Nicaraguan women's tireless activist nurtures lives in context of repression. Women in Nicaragua are built social fabrics and network, the fundamental matrix for an enduring democracy. As we continually promote agendas focuses on critical thinking around social justice, equity, and sustainable development, and human and women's rights, we are undermining the evil in our land and educating our people in freedom and plenty. I urge all feminist organizations to act within the context of the fight for democracy, because feminists will have no hold in a totalitarian regime. In these times, especially in Nicaragua, the fight is bigger than women's issues, and at the same time, it's for us and it's for women's. We can always act, and I hope we establish it as a duty. We must act. It happened in Nicaragua the first time when in 2007, the regime denied women's organization to demonstrate each 25th of November. The next 25th of November, we will be celebrating the International Day against violence, against women's violence. And we used to demonstrate in that days before 2007. And the regime start with us, denying us that right. And when that happened, nobody said nothing. Only feminists was in the street and denouncing that. And everybody was like shocked, but nothing happened. There is still time, but it's not, it is undoubtedly more complex right now. The horror that we experience in Nicaragua affects the region and the continent. Nicaragua needs everyone's voice and actions to achieve justice, democracy, human rights, reproductive rights, including, of course, the right of abortion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we want to open it up while people are thinking. I'm just struck by the common theme across each of your panels is just how inextricable the full range of reproductive rights are to human rights, as Pyle laid out. Not only the right to bodily autonomy, as represented in abortion, but the proactive rights of having the right to decide how many children, space children, and to have the means to have their own health and healthy children and families. I think another really important theme is how authoritarian regimes, among the range of human rights violations and anti-democratic actions they take, fundamental to authoritarian regimes is indeed restricting women's rights, women's reproductive rights, trying, to force women and other people who can get pregnant women to be mothers, and then also failing to provide the health care and services, even to do that in a way that promotes health and well-being. Yeah, the one question I'm going to ask, at PHR, we also work with a lot of human rights activists, and in Turkey, people may not know the whole medical establishment is under attack in Turkey. The Turkish Medical Association, their leaders are all, being threatened with jail. Health professionals who have spoken out against the human rights violations. And one of our colleagues in Turkey, as we were processing what has happened here in the last week, said, you have to realize how quickly it can happen. You have to realize how quickly democratic institutions can be undermined. And so you look at Turkey, you look at Hungary. And so, our colleagues in Turkey said, what did Erdogan was, I think, elected with the popular vote in 2003, and how quickly he was able to move. And what do? You pack the judiciary, you basically assume control of the media, whether by how Erdogan did or by, in Hungary, they just bought it up, they privatized it. And then you start implementing a range of anti-democratic, you control independent organizations, you try to restrict women's rights. And I am struck by the fact that in some ways, civil society in Turkey, as I mentioned after you spoke, that there has been a movement, and at least in one way, I don't know what other laws have passed, but that at least he has not managed to pass an abortion ban. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, because that does seem like a form of resistance that has been successful. And then please, after this question, I'm hoping all of you will come forward with questions. One.
Yes.
Vote clearing question.
Michelle, thank you so much for this question. So that's true. When the AKP government came into power in 2003, things changed, but not that quickly. I think Turkey was different than Hungary in the sense that maybe it was similar to Nicaragua. Erdogan came into power using human rights framework. So there was the European Union accession process in Turkey. So there were a lot of talk about extending human rights, extending the democratic institutions. And there were a lot of laws that passed with that push. But then when he came to power for the second and third time, then things started to change. But it's also part of the global phenomena, right? So that we have this anti-gender movement all around the world, in Hungary, in Poland, in other countries, in Russia. So the anti-gender backlash, the attacks on human rights, women's rights, trans rights, gay rights, so they are all connected, and this kind of paranoia about, like gender not being binary. So I think it's kind of also that kind of part of the global trend that we are seeing in many places. So in that sense, I think Turkey was a bit different than US, for instance, in the sense that the government came into power using kind of human rights frameworks. But then it was a very tactical thing because they didn't really believe in it. And then it became apparent later.
Please, I think we have until 5:30, is that right? Yeah, so we have 30 minutes for discussion, questions. I'm going to go as I see, and I saw Siobhan in the front.
We also have questions online as well.
Oh, okay, so it's always good to sit in the front, because then your question can go first, so you're modeling. Maybe we'll go between in-person, online, between us.
So I've been thinking a lot about this issue of the connection to maternal mortality and the risk of losing the evidence. So historically it's been very difficult to document what's a maternal death until finally we got that box on the birth record, or the death record. Are they pregnant when they died? Or it would be very easy to take that off, right? So, and especially with the attacks against CDC, although, it's at a state to state level, so maybe we could tell in Michigan, but not in Texas. And then, also with the attack against the use of mifepristone, for the medical abortions, which in fact, does permit earlier abortions often. So it's kind of contradictory, but it's the important use for it to prevent hemorrhage during birth. And with the restrictions on it, that we're going to see such an increase, not only in these horrific situations of denying of care when a woman is bleeding and infected because of a miscarriage. But in, the delivery situation, so I'm really concerned that evidence is going to become increasingly important in the US because it has been documented every place you restrict abortion, but we may well lose our ability to know that evidence issue. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that issue.
Everyone's just trying to pile into something you've been thinking about.
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. And I think it is really important to be asking. I didn't talk much about PHR's work, but a lot of what we've been trying to do is document the impacts in real time. It hasn't been as focused on the forensic evidence, but really much more focused on actually engaging with clinicians to understand their stories and their experiences working under these bans. So at PHR, we really recognize that clinicians are on the front lines. They're both being targeted under these laws, which largely are not criminalizing pregnant people. They're criminalizing physicians or those who provide abortions, right, or are involved in abortions. So clinicians are really on the front lines, both because they're targeted under these laws, but also because they're the ones being asked to deny the care, and they're seeing firsthand what the impact of that denial is from a medical perspective. And then even as patients come back, really understanding the psychological and other trauma that it's caused, as well as longer term health harm. And what we've found in the research that we've done, Michele and I and others together at PHR with partners from CRR, from Louisiana Lift, Oklahoma, Call for Reproductive Justice, a range of other organizations, RH Impact, is really that it is absolutely leading to delays and denials of care. It's leading to barriers in abortion care itself and to miscarriage treatment, but also to prenatal care, for example. So actually that prenatal care is now being delayed, even in a case where there's no suspected miscarriage happening or suspected abortion, because clinicians are nervous about seeing a patient that early on when miscarriage risk is high. We're also seeing a lot of concern around treatment of patients who are pregnant, who may need cancer treatment or may need other care because you can't provide some of the cancer treatments when somebody is pregnant. And so it leads to all sorts of delays as the hospital tries to figure out, can they provide the termination? Is this considered an abortion to save the life of a pregnant person? If it's a cancer treatment, right, that they are providing the abortion for, it's not the pregnancy itself that's causing the risk. It's the cancer that's causing the risk. And how do we parse that legally? So there are a lot of questions that are arising here for clinicians as they try to navigate these laws. And we're really trying to document what we can. I'm really interested in the idea of also doing broader analysis, not just around deaths, but also around the harm that is caused by having to travel for abortion, what it looks like to have to travel. And as I just shared, in these two cases from Ireland, right, these women were forced to travel from Ireland to the UK, and the countries are so small there. In some ways, it's the equivalent here of somebody having to travel from Florida to Illinois to access an abortion, right? So it is actually important for us to be thinking about the ways in which we are compounding the harm and suffering that individuals are facing with unwanted pregnancies, when we're also mandating them to have to travel. And then crucially, who is left out, right? Who is not able to travel because they don't have the means, they don't have the autonomy. Even if they could afford the travel, they don't have anyone to watch, their elderly parents or their young children, which is something we documented in Florida. So actually just trying to capture all of this as it's unfolding. Some of these laws are also yo-yoing back and forth, and we're trying to capture them as they go into effect. So in Idaho, for example, the Supreme Court lifted what's called a stay on the enforcement of Idaho's Idaho's abortion ban. Sorry, it's not 6 week, but it's Idaho's abortion ban, which only has a life exception and then some very narrow exceptions around rape and fetal impairment, but doesn't have a health exception. And so the Supreme Court allowed it to go into effect from January to June, and then blocked it again. And so we really did quick research together with, clinicians who were receiving the patients from Idaho who were denied care, and then some who were treating in Idaho, to understand the impact. So we're absolutely trying to capture the evidence as it's coming in. But you're right that I think the attacks on being able to document in this way are going to increase. We've had to be really careful already and trying to protect the identity of the clinicians, ensure that we're not documenting or allowing clinicians to share things that might be legally risky for them. And we're really working hard to make sure we're protecting clinicians who do come forward and share their stories, because I think the environment is going to get more and more restrictive.
Just two quick things on that. I don't know if this is very much about the US, but one, I think everyone agrees that mifepristone is going to be attacked. That's going to be probably one of the first things that will happen. We have Lisa Harris here. I don't want to put her on the spot, but a leading expert on some of these questions. But so I do think there's a sense that mifepristone already in Louisiana, that you may not be aware, it's a controlled substance. I mean, that's crazy.
Misoprostol.
Oh, misoprostol is. Oh, I thought
They're two different drugs. They're both under attack, but
I thought mifepristone was they had put it as a.
no, misoprostol, which is the emergency medication for.
Okay, so I thought that Louisiana had them both as controlled.
Louisiana has them both. You're right.
They have them both
Yes,
controlled.
It's
but
both
the
of them.
Hemorrhage drug is.
Right, no, I'm saying that in Louisiana, both mifepristone and
Correct.
misoprostol are controlled substances, which is correct. Yeah. So I mean, so that's limiting the supply of both of these, even for other uses. The other thing is that I will say that when we were interviewing clinicians, we talked to some of the clinicians who are on the state commissions to document maternal morbidity and mortality. We talked to someone, a leader in the commission in Louisiana, another one in Idaho, and they are very worried that they feel that there's blocking, efforts to disband these commissions, efforts to delay. I think that's really interesting for those of you who might be looking at this. That I personally didn't realize there's like a box that's one of the ways that, but anyway, so I think they already are, as you know, they're already huge delays. I think we're 2 years behind. I don't know if we started getting any data.
Yeah, no, it's like the deaths that we're hearing about
Yeah,
now
or like,
are
yeah.
3 from 3
Yeah.
years ago.
So I think you're going to see efforts to disband these state commissions, to do a lot of things that it's going to cover up the increase in maternal morbidity and mortality.
No, just it's not about America, but it's about Nicaragua. And one example that can help here, because we live this in Nicaragua, and after 2006, when they denied the right to access of therapeutic abortion, women's organization, with the support of an international organization, made one research to see the effects of this penalization. And one of the things that they found is that the typification in the health system. So the healthcare system start after that law that denied the right to therapeutic abortion, start to typify the maternal mortality with using other names, because it was so high 1 year after that penalization that they changed the typification, and they beginning to say gynecological disease. So they didn't put the real typification to hide the reality of the impact that the penalization of the abortion had. And we leave that also with the pandemic. They change the numbers of people who die, typifying the not putting COVID, but putting respiratory disease, for example. So, and that can happen. And we need to be aware of how the health system typify these issues. Yeah.
So why don't we go to, sorry, you're going to talk about this.
Just a quick note.
Yes, or one question.
Thank you for that question. I totally agree. So research shows abortion restrictions increases mortality, and then it's a very authoritarian tactic to hinder that information evidence, right? In Turkey, it happens similarly. The government argues that mortality rates, both for maternal and infant mortality rates, much lower now, but they also kind of, they don't publish the statistics anymore publicly. So we don't really know. The public cannot really know what happens with that information, or they might just, use other terms. So I agree with Payal that documenting and having that data is still very important. Kind of respecting the confidentiality, but having that data as an evidence.
So why don't we have, I don't see, Wes, let's have a Zoom. I know we have a lot of people on Zoom.
There's a question right here.
Yeah, I was just gonna go back and forth between in person. Let's go with you and then Zoom because they're not here.
I have a question.
Okay, please.
I have a question about Turkey. I'm a Donya Human Rights Fellow, and my focus and interest is mostly on refugees and migration. So you've mentioned that there's an anxiety about the demographic changes in Turkey because of the Kurdish minority, but there's also Turkey hosts like a big number of refugees. So do you think that this anxiety has increased after the refugee crisis in Turkey? And I don't know if you have any idea how like these women are being affected like refugees, because I'm assuming it's gonna be harder for them to access healthcare.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes and no. From the government's perspective, they are mostly kind of, creating this anxiety around Kurdish women. Because they see Syrian refugees are kind of, it's different than other contexts. So the state, the government does not explicitly discriminates refugees. They are welcoming them as kind of Muslim brothers and sisters, right? So the politics is different. But in the public, there is a huge historically ingrained anti-Arab racism in Turkey. And the public, even though they are, coming from more secular leftist groups, there's this kind of very anti-Syrian rhetoric that they are coming to Turkey and there's a crisis, economic crisis as well. Everybody's already struggling. Now they are blaming, the public kind of blames the Syrian refugees for taking over these resources. So yes and no, but Syrian refugees or refugees in general, they have other healthcare facilities, institutions, apart from the kind of the national healthcare system. And many Syrian doctors, physicians, nurses are employed in those places. So they have a different set of system for the refugees, which is not enough, but it's a bit different than US, for instance, in terms of the regulations and the political rhetoric around refugees or immigration.
Thank you.
Yes, Wes, please, a Zoom question.
I have the microphone.
All right. One of the questions from Zoom to any of the panelists. Could you speak on the role of pro-natalist policies and lack of support for people and families once babies are born and how this relates to human rights?
Yes, thank you for this question. That's a very important question because these are pronatalist policies, but they don't really provide structural material changes, right? In Turkey, in the US, like even the cat lady phrase, it's kind of a very pronatalist phrase, but US is one of the kind of developing countries that has least support for pregnant people, families in terms of parental leaves or in terms of healthcare. So if these politicians would really believe in, life, they would create certain structures to kind of, support material structures to support families, right? Or to pregnant people or new parents. And I conducted an interview with Loretta Ross recently, which is now online, and she was saying the exact same thing. So this is the authoritarian playbook that these pronatalist governments or regimes or politicians, they say that they are pro-life, but they are not actually pro-life. Look at these all policies, like healthcare policies, welfare policies, education policies, which kind of disempowers families. And US is actually one of the countries that make one poorer when you have kids, which is, I mean, for someone not grow up in Turkey, it's still unimaginable for me. For someone coming from a country, very problematic country, but with a national healthcare, the US healthcare system is very unimaginable.
thinking in the context of Nicaragua, they don't care. I think Ortega and Murillo don't care about about increase the numbers of and they don't care about women's life. They don't care if you have or not an abortion. They don't care. They are doing this, and they penalize this right that exists in the Constitution since the last century. We had this right since the last century, and they deny it in 2006 because it was in the context of an alliance with church and with some groups that allow him to be or to win the election in that time. And the only interest of them is stay in power. They are a dictatorial regime. They don't care about anymore. So I think that it's an interesting question, but always we need to see the context in each time that we think in these issues. We always need to put these rights and in general in the context where we are fighting for. That's my.
Paul, did you want to say anything about this in terms of the states that have abortion bans compared to the states that don't?
Yeah, and actually I answered a different question that relates to this on Zoom. So I was trying to answer some of them virtually just because I know it's difficult. And actually I wanted to touch on reproductive oppression as a concept. And I think one thing that I think the reproductive justice movement here in the US has done really effectively is talk about how it's actually not necessarily about limiting births for example, Black women in the US. It's not actually about forcing births for Black women in the US. It's actually about deprivation of reproductive autonomy entirely. It's about being unable to control whether and how you're pregnant, whether and what your family looks like, when you have children, and how you have them, with whom you can have them. It's actually about taking apart that whole ability to make decisions, because by not being able to control that part of your life, you cannot make decisions around education. You cannot make decisions around employment. You cannot actually break free of a lot of the different socioeconomic kind of barriers that trap people, right, in cycles of poverty or violence. And so it's not just that they are denying benefits. It's actually about denying all control and all ability to make that decision. And so, for example, right, you'll see that Black women have less access to abortion, but they also have less access to proper maternity care. So it's not actually about wanting Black women to give birth. And it's not about wanting Black women to not give birth. It's actually about not wanting Black women to be able to make decisions, right? And not be able to pursue, I love this phrase from a lot of activists in Latin America, your life goals, right? Your life path, to not be able to actually have any control over achieving that path, that dream you have for yourself. And by doing so, really trapping you in these systems of oppression and power and disempower.
I'm just going to say one final thing to that. When you look at the US states that have abortion bans, they, I would say most of them, if not universally, they tend to have the worst social services and health services. You look at Louisiana, they slashed Medicaid. And so I think you can actually almost chart the states where they have very strict abortion bans, and you can pretty much track that they will have much higher disparities in maternal, infant morbidity, mortality, with particular Black women often having 2-3 times worse maternal morbidity and higher mortality and infant mortality. And you also can track that there's an inverse relationship with the type of support that one needs to be able to support healthy families. So I don't know that these states, their rhetoric is pro-natalist. They're not doing anything like giving incentives. I don't know if Erdogan is giving cash incentives if you have a certain number of kids, but there is very much, and I really, Kyle, that was so powerful, your formulation of what the aim is. Yes. So now Okay, I think you, were you next? I'm not,
I think, yeah, but
Yeah.
please go ahead. Yeah.
oh, okay.
Sure.
Oh, I don't know, yeah.
Oh, thank
We'll,
you.
we'll do next before the Zoom, yeah.
Thank you
So much. Thank you so much for setting up this panel. Thank you for all the panelists. It's very interesting and thought-provoking. So I'm an assistant professor in art and design here, and I'm really interested in thinking about what SETA's, like the description of SETA's research on like technology and how technology like also creates monitoring, surveillance of reproductive rights, and maybe if you also have maybe something more hopeful into like how activists are also countering these technologies. So yeah, that would be my question. Thank you.
So you go, because we actually literally snatched the microphone from you, so.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you for these very powerful, inspiring, and troubling talks that you've given us. I wanted to put in a word for the mental health implications of the wide range of issues that we're talking about, because when human rights are violated, fundamental justice and human rights all reflect mental health issues as a part of our concern for health. And, as a psychologist who's worked with, interviewed people who have been tortured or had.
Mike, and I'm not sure Pyle can hear. Can you hear him, Pyle? Okay, yeah.
I'm afraid I don't. Is it any better?
Yes.
I should probably just speak louder.
I can hear you perfectly, actually.
Good, yeah.
I didn't want to do too much with it, but so I mean, I just wanted to say that for people who have been through torture and solitary confinement and these kinds of experiences that you're bringing together and thinking about the wide range of human rights, the psychological sequelae of these experiences far outdistance the physiological manifestations. So I just wanted, as we're thinking about reproductive rights and the impact of women all around the world, I just want to include thinking about mental health as an important part of health as well.
Comments to that? Yeah.
No, I fully agree with that. I think that's actually, when you look at even the case law, right? Even the law can recognize this. So even the case law from the Human Rights Committee, for example, recognizes the trauma and the distress that's caused by being forced to carry a pregnancy to term if it's a fetal pregnancy, right? There's actually one case from Peru that I didn't discuss. That was a young girl. She had an anencephalic fetus. She was forced to give birth and then forced to breastfeed for 4 days while she watched her baby die. And that was also recognized as torture and cruel and human degrading treatment, and not because of the physical risks to her, although there were some risks, but that wasn't really the core of the case. The core of the case was the psychological trauma of being forced to continue a pregnancy and to watch your baby die in that way when that is not what you thought was best for you or for your what you had hoped to be your child. And so I think that's really it's a really powerful point. And I think there's also all these ways that we see travel as causing distress. We did this research, as I mentioned, in Idaho that was looking at individuals who had to leave Idaho and literally, be like airlifted out, right? They're in really acute physical situations, but they were able to access care. But then there's also the piece of what does it mean to be separated from your family when you're going through something like that, even if the physicians can actually treat you, to be alone and to be going through something like that, and knowing that it's also going to cost a lot of money. You're separated. You don't know when you're going to be able to go home. You may have children at home. There's so many different layers, and I think that piece is also really important. So yeah, just really want to thank you for making that point.
And one other thing, your point is so important too. Like when you think about the cruelty, and again, I'm going to look at Lisa for this. I think none of the states that have abortion bans allow any psychological exception. So, a suicidal pregnant patient, someone who has severe depression, and is at risk. So I think every state, does any state have an emotional, psychological? So none of them have an exception for mental health.
Some specify even physical health, like threat to physical health, as a way of saying not mental health.
Right.
But I don't know if all of them have.
Yeah, and my understanding is that none have, and some of them explicitly say
some explicitly
psychological health is not considered health. So Cool, so cool. Okay, so you, okay, thank you.
I have a question for Tamara. It might be, oh, sorry. Thanks. This might be like hyper specific, but so I know that Daniel Ortega's Frente Sandinista once incorporated like women's and children's programs, and during his first term, it didn't seem that he had such a vested interest in kind of backtracking and decreasing women's rights. Do you think that this shift is because of a change in the party's platform, or more of his own opinion changing?
He he win the power when he get into the power in 2007. The first thing that he did was going through women's movement and feminist movement and denying women's our rights. So it's not because he changed. He was always even we have some interviews of feminists. Donia, the Donian Human Rights Institute had the university has this, the Global Feminist, has some interviews of feminist women from Nicaragua that was part of the FSLN in the 80s, and her testimonies are that man was a misogynist since then. You know, it's not that something changed one day from another. It's the difference is that many people didn't see the sign in the right time. And that's what we need to be aware today. We are looking the signs and we need to act right now. We don't need to wait because the signs are telling us that things are not gonna change if this kind of people comes to power. You know, it's, I don't know, we have more Nicaraguan women here and can answer better the question, but it's okay for you?
Yeah. So Wes, I don't know, we still have a bunch of questions. I'm sorry?
We didn't respond to her. The one about technology and surveillance and monitoring reproductive rights.
I thought,
So that the question was about monitoring reproduction, surveilling reproduction. So like I work on databases in Turkey, in Turkey's public health clinics, in this pronatalist context, and what kind of data is being collected by the government and what happens to that data, who is collecting. So there's kind of a lot of investment in collecting women's abortion or people's abortion information, or menstruation, or kind of all this kind of reproductive sexual health information. So what happens to that data? But we also know that there is high rates of mortality in certain communities in the US, for instance, for Black and Indigenous women. There's a high maternal mortality, but those databases doesn't really show these inequalities. So I think it's important kind of, creating evidence, creating information, documenting, but also be cognizant about how that information will be collected, but also what it is omitting, what it is collecting. So we need to, I think, make kind of smart observations about that. So that's a big issue in Turkey, for instance, that kind of information, using information for governmental reproductive repression and surveillance.
did you want to say something on this? I think there's a concern about that in the US, that type of surveillance.
Right. Yeah, there is certainly a lot of concern, and there has been work done with the current health and the HHS, the US Health Department, essentially around trying to protect health-related data when it comes to abortion. But there are certainly a lot of concerns, especially as we start moving now right into, we have states that have laws that provide and allow abortion. We have states that deny abortion. And then we have patients that are moving between these states. And there's a lot of concern about the attempt to try to seek the data of those patients who are seeking care in haven states and states that allow abortion, and what happens as they travel. There's obviously a lot of concern here as well about period tracking apps and things like that being used to try to monitor pregnancy status. We'll see how much of it plays out, but I think it absolutely is a major area of concern, and really thinking about how do we ensure that we are protecting this data, that physicians aren't forced to disclose when they think that somebody has had an abortion. And actually, there's these even, so much of it is actually low tech. We think of it as the technological piece, but actually, in the work I did in the Philippines, documenting the impact of the abortion ban there in the Philippines, has a complete abortion ban, no exceptions, not even a life exception. And essentially what was happening is that individuals were essentially being turned in by their physicians, right? So they would come in, and it wasn't always even people that had induced an abortion. It could be in miscarriage care. And so there's already a tendency, right, for physicians to worry that they're aiding and abetting, right? And to worry about these really severe criminal penalties that these laws impart. And so, I think when you have that, and then you start adding in the technological factor and what happens if the evidence is subpoenaed, your medical records are subpoenaed, there are real concerns. And what we're hearing is then clinicians are also afraid of documenting. They don't want to document because they're afraid both of low tech, so they're afraid of stigma that may arise from other physicians or other healthcare workers who are anti-choice, but then also at a higher tech level, what if these records are ever discovered, right, and are able to be pulled into court and then used to prosecute. So I think there's many dimensions around the information, but what it can lead to is gaps in care. So in Louisiana, we documented, there was a physician who did, who recognized that the patient was pregnant, she needed to have access to an abortion, but then sent a referral to a hospital in New Orleans, I think it was, and didn't write that there was an emergency, essentially, didn't write that the person needed an abortion. And so then the MFM, right, in that hospital didn't prioritize seeing that patient because they didn't realize it was an emergency. But that initial physician, I think, didn't want to document what was happening because they didn't want to be seen as being the one who said that somebody needed to have an abortion, and they also didn't want the patient potentially to be stigmatized. So there's these barriers that come up when we don't document properly that also need to be understood.
So you're going to respond, and then I'm afraid we do have to end because I know, Pyle, you have to leave. So yeah.
Just quickly, because I'm not gonna pardon myself if I don't complete this answer, and it's related with the fact that Ortega was accused by violation by her stepdaughter since 1997, and the feminist movement support this stepdaughter who was accusing him, and because of that, when he get the power in 2007, he reached out against feminist movement. But this is important because I can see some similarities here, and yeah. So, but answering your as you know, Emilia, in a totalitarian regime as Nicaraguan, everything that women do to have these data and register all these issues are in the clandestinity, and we need more technology. We need more technology because that can be more safe and more easier for her. So that's one of the things that we can improve for that work.
Well, thank you, all of you. This is something different. Really, the fact that there were so many questions, I'm sorry we weren't able to get to your questions, but I think all of you would be happy to not stay because I think it's late, but that you to address questions by email, and I think all of you emailed.